The last letter from the Titanic engineer. What he knew before it sank, hours before the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. One man may have understood something the passengers never saw. Not a millionaire, not a captain, not a man standing on the grand staircase, listening to music and pretending the night was still ordinary. An engineer. A man who knew the ship from the inside. He knew the sound of her boilers. He knew the pressure in her lungs. He knew the way steel complained when the sea pushed back. And somewhere in the story, there is said to be a letter. A final note. A warning that did not scream. It whispered. The kind of warning people only understand after the disaster has already happened. The letter did not say, "The Titanic will sink." It did not need to. What made it frightening was something smaller. A nervous sentence, a hint of doubt. A man describing a ship everyone else believed was almost beyond nature. And if that letter was real, it leaves one question that still feels cold more than a century later. Did someone aboard Titanic understand the danger before the iceberg ever appeared? The Titanic has been called many things. A wonder, a palace, a floating city, a symbol of human progress. But to the men below deck, she was something different. She was heat. She was noise. She was metal, steam, coal dust, valves, gauges, pipes, and pressure. Above them, passengers walked through polished corridors. They touched carved wood. They drank, laughed, wrote postcards, and believed they were crossing the ocean on the safest ship ever built. Below them, men worked in a world most passengers would never see. The engine rooms did not feel like luxury. They felt alive. The floor trembled. The air burned. The ship breathed in a heavy rhythm, like a giant animal moving through darkness. And the engineers listened. That is what engineers do. They do not only look at machines, they listen to them. A strange vibration, a pressure change, a sound that comes half a second too late, a silence where there should be noise. These are the small things that can tell a man something is wrong before anyone else feels afraid. The Titanic was built with confidence. That word matters. Not safety. Confidence. She had 16 watertight compartments, a modern design that helped create the belief that she could survive serious damage. But that confidence had a limit. If too many compartments flooded, the math changed. The ocean did not care about reputation. The ship's watertight compartments were an important safety feature, but the disaster showed that they were not enough when damage spread too far. That is where the mystery begins, because an engineer would have understood something most passengers did not. A ship is never unsinkable. It is only untested. The letter, as the story goes, was written in the quiet hours before the disaster. Not as a public warning, not as an official report, something more private. A man putting his thoughts on paper because he could not put them anywhere else. Maybe he wrote to his wife, maybe to a brother, maybe to someone waiting at home, someone who would never hear his voice again. The paper was folded. The ink was uneven. Some words were ordinary. Cold weather, long hours, a hard crossing, a ship too proud for her own good. That last idea is what stays with you. Too proud. Not broken, not doomed. Too proud. There is a difference. A broken ship frightens people. A proud ship makes them careless. And carelessness does not look dangerous at first. It looks like confidence. It looks like a captain keeping schedule. It looks like passengers trusting the name painted on the bow. It looks like a company believing its own legend. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the Atlantic was calm. Too calm, some would later say. The sea did not roar around the Titanic. It lay flat and dark, almost polished. There was no moon bright enough to help the lookouts. Ice warnings had reached the ship that day. That much belongs to history. The danger was not imaginary. Other vessels had reported ice in the North Atlantic. Titanic was moving through a region where ice was known to be present. But the ship kept going. This is where the story becomes less about conspiracy and more about something more uncomfortable. Human judgment. The Titanic did not need a villain to become a tragedy. It needed assumptions. It needed people to believe that modern engineering had made old fears smaller. It needed speed, darkness, ice, and a culture that trusted steel more than caution. That is what makes the engineer's possible letter so haunting. It does not have to prove a secret plot. It only has to show that someone felt the arrogance in the air. Imagine him that night. Not on the grand staircase, not under crystal lights. Down below. His shirt damp with heat, his hands marked by work, his ears full of the steady thunder of machinery. Maybe he had heard the passengers call the ship unsinkable. Maybe he had heard officers speak calmly about ice. Maybe he had seen enough ships to know the sea never respects confidence. And maybe, while the Titanic pushed west into the dark, he wrote what he could not say aloud. A line like this: "She is a magnificent ship, but men speak of her as if the ocean has already surrendered." That is the kind of sentence that does not sound dangerous when it is written. Only later, after the lights go out. At 11:40 p.m. the iceberg came, not like a monster from a story, not with thunder. It arrived as a shape in the darkness. Too late. The order was given. The ship turned. But not enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side. A long wound. A quiet disaster. That detail matters. In movies, disaster announces itself. In real life, it often begins with confusion. Some passengers barely felt the collision. A bump, a shudder, a strange pause in the night. People opened doors. They stepped into hallways. They asked each other what had happened. Some laughed. Some went back to their rooms. A few picked up pieces of ice from the deck as if the ocean had sent them a souvenir. But below, the truth moved faster. Water does not need permission. It entered where steel had opened. It moved through the lower spaces. It found paths. It rose. And the men who understood the ship began to understand the night. Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer, inspected the damage and reportedly concluded that the ship had only about 1 to 2 hours left. That was not panic. That was calculation. Britannica's timeline records, Andrews assessing the flooding and recognizing the fatal meaning of too many compartments filling with water. That is the most chilling part of the Titanic story. There was a moment when the ship still looked alive. The lights were still on. The band would later play. The first-class rooms still looked elegant. The sea still looked calm. But inside the calculations, Titanic was already dying. The passengers did not know it yet. The engineers did. Think about what that means. A disaster can be final before it looks final. A ship can be lost while people are still buttoning coats. A man can understand the ending while everyone else is still waiting for an explanation. If the engineer's letter existed, then it becomes more than a piece of paper. It becomes a voice from the lower decks. A voice saying, "You were looking in the wrong place. You were looking at the chandeliers. You should have been listening to the hull. You were looking at the millionaires. You should have been watching the waterline. You were looking at the promise. You should have been asking what the promise was built on." As the night deepened, the Titanic became two worlds. Above, there was hesitation, Passengers did not want to leave warmth for a small boat hanging over black water. Some believed the lifeboats were only a precaution. Some thought another ship would arrive soon. Some could not imagine that a vessel this large, this famous, this expensive, was truly going down. Below, men fought to keep power alive. The engineers and stokers stayed in the lower parts of the ship, working in conditions that must have been terrifying. Their work mattered. As long as the lights burned, people could move. As long as power remained, signals could be sent. As long as the ship looked controlled, panic could be delayed. There is something almost unbearable about that. The men who knew the danger most clearly were among the least likely to survive it. They were not standing near the lifeboats. They were not wrapped in blankets. They were deep inside a dying machine, trying to buy minutes for strangers above them. That is not legend. That is sacrifice. And it changes the way the letter feels. If a Titanic engineer wrote one final warning, he was not writing from comfort. He was writing from knowledge. He understood that ships are not saved by luxury. They are saved by margins, by caution, by drills, by enough boats, by men willing to question the story everyone else wants to believe. There had been a scheduled lifeboat drill earlier on April 14th, but it was canceled. Britannica notes this detail in the timeline of Titanic's final day. That one fact does not explain the whole disaster. But in a story full of missed chances, it is hard not to feel its weight. The lifeboats themselves became one of the most painful parts of the night. Titanic carried lifeboats, but not enough for everyone aboard. Some boats left without being filled to capacity. Some passengers waited too long. Some crew members had to make impossible decisions in freezing darkness. This is where the tragedy becomes human. Not only because people died, but because so many moments were almost different. A drill held, a warning treated with more fear, a slower speed, a different turn, a few more boats, a few more minutes. History is full of disasters that look inevitable after they happen. But before they happen, they are made of small choices. That is why the engineer's warning, real or rumored, feels powerful. It gives shape to the discomfort. It says someone may have sensed the flaw before the world had a name for it. Not the flaw in the steel alone. The flaw in the thinking. The Titanic was not destroyed only by ice. It was destroyed by distance between reality and belief. Reality was cold water. Belief was she cannot sink. Reality was limited lifeboats. Belief was we will never need them all. Reality was a dark sea with ice warnings. Belief was we can keep going. Reality was an engineer listening to a ship. Belief was passengers hearing only music. After midnight, the angle changed. Slowly at first. Then enough that people could feel it. The bow dipped lower, the decks tilted. The truth became visible. At some point, even the proudest illusion breaks. People who had doubted began to run. People who had laughed became silent. The Atlantic took away the argument. No one could negotiate with the water. No one could explain the ship back to the surface. The engineers kept working. That image should stay with us. Not because it is dramatic, because it is practical. Someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to keep the pumps moving as long as possible. Someone had to give the wireless operators time. Someone had to make the ship useful even while it was dying. The Titanic's wireless distress calls helped bring the ERMS Carpathia to the rescue, though too late to save most of those who went into the freezing water. Survivors were picked up by Carpathia in the early morning hours after the sinking. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, Titanic was gone. The ship that had been called a marvel of the modern age was under the sea. The lights vanished. The noise stopped. And then there was only the ocean. For the survivors, the silence was almost worse than the sinking. A field of lifeboats. Dark water, cold air, voices fading. A world that had changed in less than 3 hours. And somewhere in that silence, the question remained. What did the men below deck know? What had they feared? What had they seen in the ship that no passenger could see? The supposed final letter does not need to reveal a hidden villain to matter. It does not need to accuse a company. It does not need to rewrite the official story. Its power is smaller and maybe stronger. It reminds us that disaster often announces itself quietly, in a sentence, in a doubt, in a professional's discomfort, in the uneasy feeling of someone who knows a machine too well to worship it. That is why the Titanic still holds people. Not because we do not know what happened. We know enough. An iceberg, flooded compartments, not enough lifeboat capacity for all aboard. A rescue that came after the ship had already disappeared. The facts are terrible. But the mystery is deeper than the facts. The mystery is why intelligent people ignored the limits in front of them. Why a ship built by brilliant hands became a symbol of blind faith. Why warnings can exist and still fail. Why the people closest to danger are often the least heard. Maybe the letter was not a confession. Maybe it was not proof of a conspiracy. Maybe it was something more human. A man looking at the greatest ship in the world and feeling, somewhere deep inside, that greatness had made everyone careless. And that is more frightening than a secret plot. Because arrogance does not need to hide in locked rooms. It can stand in public. It can wear a uniform. It can sell tickets. It can print advertisements. It can tell people the ship is safe because the ship is famous. It can convince an entire age that progress has outgrown disaster. But the ocean was never impressed. The ocean did not care about first class. It did not care about chandeliers. It did not care about steel. It did not care about reputation. It only found the weakness and entered. More than a century later, the Titanic is still not just a shipwreck. It is a warning about the stories people tell themselves when they want to feel untouchable. The last letter, whether preserved in fact or carried through rumor, gives that warning a human voice. Not a shout, not a prophecy. Just a man below deck listening to the ship breathe, while the world above him believed the future had already been conquered. Maybe he knew too much. Maybe he only feared what others refused to consider. Maybe he wrote the truth in the only place it could survive, on paper, in ink, before the water reached the lights. And maybe that is why the story still feels unfinished. Because the Titanic did not sink in one moment. It sank first in the minds of the men who believed it could not, then in the calculations of the men who knew it would. And finally, in the freezing dark, where confidence met the Atlantic and lost. So the next time you hear the Titanic called unsinkable, listen closer. Not to the music, not to the legend. Listen to the lower decks, to the machinery, to the men who stayed behind, to the warning that may have been written too softly, too late. Because sometimes history does not hide its secrets in locked vaults. Sometimes it hides them in plain sight. In the sentence no one wanted to read, in the doubt no one wanted to hear, in the final letter from a man who understood the ship from the inside. And knew the ocean did too.